LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today,
everything you'll ever need to know about the art and science of storytelling.
Story is what we do. Story is who we are. Story is human life itself. This is no exaggeration.
That's a line from a new book, a fantastic new book by Will Storr.
We just love Will Storr here at The Next Big Idea. We had him on the show a few years ago to discuss his last book, The Status Game. It was a conversation that I keep coming back to that fundamentally shifted how I think about humans, about what makes us tick.
Yes, totally resonated for me as well. And this new book expands on a couple of those themes.
It's called A Story is a Deal. It comes out today. It helped me both more deeply understand human behavior and get better at one of life's most important skills, learning how to tell a great story.
And unlike traditional storytelling guides that just obsess over mechanics, rising action, falling action, save the cat, return with the elixir, Will drills down to something more fundamental. He exposes the science behind why stories are so effective, what they do to our brains on an individual level, collectively. Because if you don't understand that, it turns out you don't actually understand story at all.
To put it another way, for Will, quote, the original and greatest storyteller is the human brain. So if you want to master the art of storytelling, you need to first understand the science of how our brains engage with stories, the social psychology, the neuroscience, and the evolutionary biology behind every good yarn.
So today, we'll explore what stories are and where they come from.
How they unlock our species' singular talent for collaboration, enabling, well, pretty much everything that we've accomplished collectively.
And how you can use stories to lead, motivate, and persuade.
And perhaps even be a better hero of your own story.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Will Storr, welcome back to The Next Big Idea.
Thanks, Caleb. It's great to be here. I'm happy to be here again.
We are so excited about your new book, A Story is a Deal, that for the first time in Next Big Idea history, we're going to host this interview together. Rufus and I are both going to be on mic because both of us have a ton of questions for you.
Fantastic.
I wish you could have heard this behind the scenes. We basically fought over you.
We did.
Caleb was grabbing you by the arm. I was grabbing you by the leg. And we thought, you know what, Let's stop fighting. We'll both interview Will.
Yeah, you are like the cute girl in the high school class that we both had a crush on.
What a scary thought.
Yes, particularly now that we have some details about your high school outfits.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. So Will, new book, A Story is a Deal. As with all of your work, you cover so much ground. I mean, there's evolution in here, there's psychology, there's neuroscience, you get into the nuts and bolts of storytelling. But, since this is the beginning of our conversation, let's just take a minute and talk about beginnings. And you say, and I'm quoting you here, successful stories begin with a moment of change that incites surprise and curiosity, right? We want to have an opening that just grabs our attention. It taunts us, to use your word, right? Our brains are suddenly desperate to figure out what's going to happen next. And so I thought maybe we could see if your new book follows its own advice. So let's go to page 1, sentence 1. The book begins, "Fuck you, carry you.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
my attention has been grabbed. I'm surprised. I'm curious. I think listeners are feeling the same way. What happens next, Will?
Yeah, this is the way I'm beginning the story of Theranos, the Elizabeth Holmes startup, which famously all kind of crashed and burned. And the Carrie you that they're saying fuck you to is the journalist that kind of blew up their story. And I use her as a great example of somebody who was this naturally born gifted storyteller, Elizabeth Holmes. I mean, you know, she dreamed this device into reality which didn't exist, which you could take a one drop of blood and do this myriad of tests on you, which you need a few vials of blood to do. And she was so convincing in her storytelling that she persuaded some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world to invest, to sit on a board of directors, you know, including Rupert Murdoch, which is his biggest investment ever outside of his own family of companies, you know, the Walmart family. And what was really amazing to me about this story was that these people didn't do any due process. They were so swept up in this story of Elizabeth Holmes, this genius female tech founder, that they just threw money at her and threw reputation at her. And at the peak of her powers, the company was valued at $9 billion, even though it didn't exist. It was all a story. So I just thought it's a really good way of showing the incredible power of story to persuade even the most cynical, successful, powerful people in the world.
We don't want to be Elizabeth Holmes in that we don't want to perpetrate fraud, but we do want to create really potent stories that draw people in, stories that we inhabit and that people then cohabitate with us, right? Is that kind of the thrust?
Yeah, you know, story is how we humans experience the world. The human brain takes reality and turns it into a story, and that's how it works. So we're constantly being persuaded by the stories of other people. We're constantly telling ourselves stories to motivate ourselves and get ourselves through the day. So, you know, what I wanted to do with the story as a deal is to just to really sort of pick apart how that works and why it works in the way that it does.
And the bigger point you make, Will, is that Elizabeth Holmes didn't just tell a potent story, she lived it. And I think that's crucial, isn't it? You call this story being. Why is this important?
Yeah, this is one of the big breakthroughs for me. There's so many books on storytelling and how persuasive storytelling, and it always sticks with the storytelling, which is the communication of story in narrative form, be it a TV ad or a movie or a speech. But the breakthrough for me is that we are a story. We experience our lives as a story.
Yes.
We are the hero of our own unfolding narrative. So at least as important, actually even more important, is understanding this concept of story being, which is that we are characters in other people's stories. We're showing up as archetypal characters. Are we an ally? Are we a villain? Are we a teacher? Are we a betrayer? Are we a jester? So that art of story being is what really successful persuaders do. It's certainly what Elizabeth Holmes did. I mean, she was a great storyteller. She had this story about wanting to save the world and reduce suffering and this, that, and the other. But much more impressive was her story being. I mean, she was basically cosplaying Steve Jobs, famously, to the extent where she would even wear his polo neck jumpers and have the thermostat in the offices turned down, so even on a hot day she could still wear the polo neck. You know, she dropped the octaves of her voice down. She would stare at you with his eyes, and so she was performing this great female tech genius. And it was the story being, I think, more than anything that persuaded these people. You know, she walked into the room and she performed a character in a story. And it was the performance of that story, which was the most important thing in terms of getting people swept away in her narrative.
I feel like she was cosplaying Steve Jobs to her audience, but also to herself. Like, I remember reading this detail that, like, she had heard that Steve Jobs never got a license plate for his cars because he would lease a car for 6 months. You'd get temporary license plates. And then by the time the real plate would show up, he'd get a new car. And she copied that. Like, that's not a signal that anyone else in the world understands. But for her, for that internal story that she's constructing, she's like, I am Steve Jobs. I also get new cars every 6 months.
I mean, that's a really profound point, Caleb. You know, that's really important. I mean, and it's one of the things that really makes you think again about, you know, your existence as a human being. It's that this story that we weave about who we are, yes, it's for other people, but we also believe that story ourselves. I mean, we believe the stories we tell ourselves. And that's how we get ourselves into such trouble sometimes in life. That's how we can delude ourselves and end up doing crazy things, believing crazy things, putting ourselves in danger, upsetting people, because we tell ourselves a story which is often only partly true, sometimes completely not true. And
Yes, yeah.
we're programmed to believe our own bullshit, believe our own story.
Yeah. Because stories are lies in some sense. I mean, this is part of the complexity of the power of storytelling is that it's that stories are powerful. We need them. We rely upon them, but they're also distortions in which we participate.
Absolutely. Stories are never true. At the very best, they're simplifications. They're one-eyed. They're telling you one side of the story. When you take a step back from the feverish war there is going on between the left and the right in the countries of the West, what you see is two sides who have just a different story about how the world works.
Yeah.
And I think for me, most of the time, what's true is that both sides are right. The left tell a story that we need to take care of marginalized groups and people that suffer, people who are underprivileged. That's true. We need to regulate banking and business. That's true. Otherwise, if you don't regulate them, they're psychopaths. They'll take us all. But the right tell a story about how we've got to protect the engines of growth. We've got to protect these billionaires and millionaires who create jobs and create the economy. That's also all true. But we find it very hard to believe both of those stories at once because we're this storytelling animal. So yeah, the stories are never true. They're always distorted, and at the very least, they tend to be partial. They're kind of one-eyed, one-sided.
I feel like before we get too much further, we should just zoom out and define story. Like, what is your definition, Will, of story?
In its most technical sense, a story is a unit of information that tells of the overcoming of an obstacle in pursuit of a goal. Like that's the basic elements of a story. If you don't have something overcoming an obstacle in pursuit of a goal, you don't have a story. You've got something else. You've got a scientific paper or a poem or something. So in order to have a story, it's got to have the obstacle. It's got to have the goal.
And you say that all stories lead to three themes, right? These archetypal underpinnings of all great stories. What are those three things?
Yeah, so I think to understand that, you've got to kind of understand the human being and this kind of weird storytelling animal that we are. Like, we're an ape. We're not like an ape. We are an ape. We're one of 5 species of ape. But obviously, we're very different from the other apes. We're not like the chimpanzee and the orangutan anymore. And the difference is that we tell stories. We tell stories that enable us to be highly collaborative, highly cooperative. So unlike the other apes, we don't pursue our goals and overcome our obstacles as individuals. We do it as groups, as teams, with everybody sort of playing their part. And it's that teamwork, that cooperation that's enabled us to take over the planet. And it's story that allows us to do that. So story is this device for fusing human brains together. Under the power of a story, we all face the same direction. We all have the same idea about who are the heroes, who are the villains, what are the obstacles, what are our goals, what does our happy ending look like. So it fuses these brains together and gets us all thinking as one, this one kind of groupish kind of super organism. So that's why, I argue that story has always got to be about obstacles and goals, because story is about getting a group of individual people to overcome obstacles in pursuit of goals as if they're one, as if they're a hive of ants. And what are the big obstacles and goals? Well, for humans, on one level, we're like every other animal. We want survival. So we want food and water and shelter, and we want our kids to survive and want to procreate. But we're also, because we're this groupish animal, we have these other two instincts which compel us to be successful members of this, the group, the human superorganism. The first one is that we are driven to seek connection. So we want to be accepted by other humans, whether that's romantic partners, our family, our friends, our colleagues. We all want to seek connection, and we all fear and dread ostracization, social rejection. That's a human universal.
Yeah.
And then once we're in that superorganism, we are driven to want status. So status is just the feeling of, I am valued by my group. I am offering it value. I'm respected. There is something about what I'm doing which is benefiting the group. So those are the three things: survival, connection, and status. And then when you understand that story is obstacles and goals, and human goals are survival and connection and status, you can see that these are the three themes of all archetypal stories. Like in the world of films, film like The Revenant is about survival.
Right.
A film like Brokeback Mountain is about connection. A film like Barbie or Whiplash is about status. And the movies, the stories that we feel are timeless and are so rich with meaning that we can see them again and again and again, whether it's The Godfather or Star Wars or Romeo and Juliet. These are about survival and connection and status in kind of equal proportions. They're about all the great themes of life. And I think that's why they're so rich and timeless, those stories.
This explanation of what story does is even simpler and more primal and earlier in our evolution than, say, the Joseph Campbell hero's journey. And it's a huge claim, and it really resonates for me. And I think this is part of why we fought over, and I was so delighted to be engaging with you, because all of your books will go deep into this question of who are we as a species? Why do we do what we do? You say at one point, story is what we do. Story is who we are. Story is human life itself. This is not an exaggeration, you say. And so effectively, I mean, the claim here, just to kind of go deeper on this point you're making, is that, yes, we're the most collaborative, intelligent species on the planet. We have an instinct to collaborate with the people around us. But as Harari, who we've had on the show a few times, said in *Sapiens* and I think referencing other people's work, there's a limit to how many. There's a Dunbar number. We existed in tribes of 20, 30, 150 people. There's only so many people we can interact with. But through story, we're able to collaborate with larger groups of people at much larger scales, which makes us far more effective at collectively achieving our objectives. And this is a superpower. And this arguably goes back to our ancestral environment, to our evolutionary process, hundreds of thousands, millions of years in the making.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, I bring it right back to the beginning of the evolution of humans when we came down for the trees. Like, it's currently believed that the reason that we evolved language in the first place is to swap gossip.
Wait, let's just really underline that. The reason that language evolved is to tell stories, is to gossip with that's nutty to me. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think it was assumed it was about coordination in terms of hunting. But, wolves hunt as packs. They don't need sophisticated language to do that. What you need sophisticated language for is to tell stories. And the earliest form of storytelling was thought to be gossip, because gossip is stories that's keeping the tribe working together. Mm-hmm. So gossip is who is a good person, who is a bad person. And then gossip creates this feeling of moral outrage, which motivates us to punish transgressors. But also there's positive gossip, which is this person did a heroic thing. They're amazing in the battle today with the rival tribe. We're going to celebrate them. And of course, once you've got gossip, you've got this, what I call a special effect with morality, which is humans don't experience their fellow animals as just fellow animals. They're morally drenched characters, and we see them as heroes and villains and allies. And the human world is painted over with this special effect of morality, which is a big part of how we experience our lives as a story. It's morally inflected, it's morally drenched. And that begins with storytelling at the very dawn of human life itself.
Morally drenched. I love that. And there's a rehabilitation of gossip here, which I think a lot of people listening may appreciate, which is this notion that really what is gossip at its core, but stories of who can be trusted and cannot be trusted as collaborators. And this is true of most all stories. What are stories? They are the sharing of information or examples of what a good collaborator looks like and a bad collaborator looks like. A hero is a great collaborator. A villain is a bad collaborator.
Selfish.
And if we are going to successfully, as Homo sapiens, collaborate and do extraordinary things together and overcome obstacles, we need to constantly be making these distinctions between good collaborators and bad collaborators. And in the process, of course, through these stories, we're punishing the bad collaborators, which is how Homo sapiens were able to collaborate without police forces for hundreds of thousands of years.
Exactly. And you don't get there without storytelling. You don't get there without the kind of storytelling instinct. And it is only gossip. I mean, you also needed to tell a story about the future in a way that other animals just cannot do. So if we work together to carry these logs over here, we can build a hut and then we can all live in this hut. The evolutionary biologist Michael Tomasello has famously observed, it's impossible to imagine two chimpanzees helping each other to carry a log somewhere. It just wouldn't happen. Even on that very basic level of collaboration, it doesn't exist in our cousins. So, we're telling stories about each other, morally drenched stories. We're telling stories about the future. If we work together and do this thing, we can achieve this thing. And also we're telling stories about who we are and where we came from, great tribal myths and, stories about heroes of the past. And then it becomes stories about, gods and demons. And it's all doing the same thing, which is encouraging us to collaborate and work together in the form of this kind of the human superorganism, which are the human groups, which foment all the change in the world.
Well, I learned a new word from your book, which was umwelt, which means the narrow band of experience an organism can detect. which is so cool, right? So you say a catfish's umwelt is dominated by flavor, which apparently they absorb through their skin. The umwelt of insects like tree hoppers and katydids is musical. For mole rats and sea turtles, it's the Earth's magnetic field. Birds, you say, experience unimaginable galaxies of light. They see perhaps 100 times as many colors as we do. I did not know this. But meanwhile, you say, the umwelt of humans is both obviously our sentient experiences of the world. We have exceptional vision and decent hearing and smell, but we exist simultaneously in a realm that's undetectable to every other creature. The human umwelt is story. It's almost like a whole imaginary world that we are constantly navigating. And I mean, we've been talking so far about stories that we're telling consciously, right? We're consciously gossiping and going to the movies and telling each other stories. But there's also a story world, you claim, that we maybe not always fully consciously are inhabiting. And we're jockeying for our identity and role inside of all of these stories in the story world that we inhabit. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the story world, that I call it, emerges when human brains become connected and start telling stories together. So if you think when we're born with these semi-finished brains, and the whole point of the human childhood is to kind of tune our brains into our local story world. We're literally told stories by our parents, but there's the story being too. So as children, we're continually being told off when we're bad people, when we're poor collaborators. When we're doing good collaborator stuff, we're celebrated and rewarded and applauded, we hope. So it's all about understanding that the brain tunes itself into this human story world over our very long childhoods. And a huge part of that is understanding, what does a good person want? Mm-hmm. How does a good person behave? What does a good life look like? Like the human brain's always asking this question, which is, who do I have to be in this time and place to become a hero?
Yeah.
Because a hero in a story earns connection and status. They're loved and they're valued. And that's what all humans want, to be loved and valued. Because if you're loved and valued, you're safe, you procreate, you've got food. So we're always trying to turn ourselves into a hero. But what is a hero? If you move around in culture, the definition of a hero changes. If you move around in time, the definition of a hero changes. So we live in these cultural story worlds that are very unique and individual to our time and place. So our childhood is about tuning into that local story world of finding out, what does it mean to be a hero amongst my people?
Tell me if I'm getting this right. Okay, so stories allow us to collaborate, to find people like us, and commit with them to overcome obstacles, achieve goals that we couldn't achieve on our own. This is a superpower, but at the same time, out of necessity, stories are oversimplifications. They're lies, we might even say. And meanwhile, we have this instinct to agree on common stories, to converge in our beliefs to a degree that's almost unsettling. I mean, there's kind of good news here about, like, we're so powerfully collaborative. We want to connect with each other and we want to help each other overcome obstacles. But there's also a slightly sort of dark underbelly to this, which is our ability to be deceived and deceive ourselves in this process is powerful.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the brain is not a calculator of fact and truth. The brain's not interested particularly in the truth. The brain's interested in the story. As I said before, that idea of, who do I have to be in this time and place in order to become a hero? And every group has its own story, is its own little micro story world. You go to work for an organization, they've got their own story about what it means to be a good member of this team. If you identify with that story, you're going to turn yourself into that kind of person. So we're constantly shape-shifting. We live in multiple story worlds at once, in a way. Maybe we'll go to church, maybe we'll go and play soccer, maybe we're going to go and volunteer for this organization, maybe we're going to be a family man, maybe we're going to be, a lover. All these different identities we have, these roles we play. Each one is a kind of different version of ourselves. Each one represents a different kind of story world that we're existing in at any one time. And they're all forms of collaboration, all of those things I've mentioned. In order to be a good collaborative partner for this soccer team or in this marriage or in this church, I've got to be a slightly different version of myself. So we become a slightly different version of ourselves, and our beliefs can change under the power of story, as study after study has shown.
You use the word shape-shifting and beliefs, and in the book you use the word magic, that there's something it feels almost like magic, this way that we adjust our identities and merge with other people. I mean, I have to say, occasionally, like that almost sounds kind of woo-woo, like, oh, it's magic, we're shapeshifting. So ground this, you just mentioned there are studies that back this up over and over again. Ground this a little bit for us in the science that shows this identification with people like us, this merging, the shapeshifting is actually a scientific fact.
Yeah, it's been found time and time again in lots and lots of different contexts that we are in the act of story being. When we join a story world, we change. We change who we are in order to fit in and become a better collaborator with that story world. One example which I like is about architects and architecture.
Yeah.
You might have looked out into the world, over the last 100 years and seen that modern buildings tend to look a certain way. They're rectangular, they're shiny, there's lots of grid patterns. They're kind of boring. They have flat roofs. You don't see pitch roofs anymore. I used to think that was because that's just a cheap way to make buildings. But that turns out not to be true. The reason that modern architecture looks like modern architecture is because architects think it's beautiful. And so what's interesting about that is that when you do surveys, no matter where you go in the world, architects think big shiny rectangles are beautiful.
Yeah.
But most other people don't. Most other people like curves. They like detail. They like a building that shows a sense of its geographical location.
Yeah, give me a gargoyle, please.
Exactly. So there are places in Russia, in Asia, in South America, in Europe. They all look the same. There's no sense of place. So that begs the question, how is it that the people building our buildings have this different aesthetic to the rest of the world? Like, how does that come about? So there was a psychologist over here who studied that, and they studied the preferences of young architects as they went through the process of going to university. First, they tested their sense of aesthetics generally with the general public. So they said, here are some pictures of some people. Tell us who you think are beautiful and tell us who you think are not beautiful. Rate them out of 10 in that way that people sometimes do. So they did that and they found that there was no difference. In terms of human beauty, between the general public and the young architects, there was no difference. Buildings, there was a small difference, but not much difference. They kind of liked the same buildings. But then they kept assessing them as they went through the long process of being educated in architecture. And they found that the longer they've been being educated to be an architect, the more they like straight lines, squares, grid patterns, flat roofs, all the things that we associate with ugly, boring modern architecture. And what's really interesting about that for me is that you can't argue that it's because architects have got this amazing, sophisticated, they'll go on these crazy esoteric journeys where they discover their own version of beauty. They're not, they're completely conformist. They're all like the same bloody buildings. So you've got this weird situation in where our modern worlds are being built by people who have a completely different sense of what's beautiful to the rest of us. And it's all about the story. It's, their tastes are transformed as they go to university. They meet high status architects, people they're impressed with, and they absorb their aesthetic tastes. So, that's the problem. We're constantly changing who we are, changing what we think is beautiful, changing our political beliefs, changing our personalities. But we've got this storytelling brain that tells us, no. You decided that. They call it confabulation. We confabulate this deciding character in our brains that's making these decisions. And actually, it's all subconscious. Well, no, that's too much. It's not all subconscious. A lot of it is subconscious. We're being pulled around by our subconscious. When I say it's like magic, it is a bit like magic. It's this sort of dark magic that's controlling us beneath the level of conscious awareness.
Another example of this attraction we all have to find people like us and to connect with a tribe that you share in the book that really resonated for me is you say at one point that we each emit, quote, a dense cloud of social information that transmits clues about who we are and how we perceive the external world.
I can see clouds floating off of both of you
yes,
right now.
That's right. but that's it. So as you say there, Rufus, we're all desperately interested in connecting successfully and earning status, but not with anybody, with people like us, with people that our subconscious mind single out and think that's somebody that I can collaborate with. That's somebody that can be a collaborative partner and help, and we could work together overcoming the obstacles of life. So we're constantly seeking out these people. But part of that means we're constantly driven to broadcast to other people, who am I?
Yeah.
So, so that simple fact explains hundreds of billions of dollars of the global economy we spend on dressing ourselves a certain way, buying certain books, doing our hair in a certain way. So much of the money we spend is about our identity, broadcasting who we are. And we do that in order to attract people like us to our lives and also to repel people not like us. Like even now, Rufus, like we don't, we've done podcasts before, but look, we've got very similar hair. We've got very similar shirts.
Yeah, you guys do have
We're
very
even
similar
a similar
hair.
weight. I've got books in the background. You've got this cool brick thing. Like, there's all this subconscious stuff in our backgrounds, which is saying we have things deeply in common.
So wait, Will, are you saying we don't have anything in common?
No, you're a bit young, Caleb, But no, you do. I mean, you can just tell. I mean, you can just tell all three of us, we've even, so it's a really sort of powerful thing that's sort of changed the way I see human beings is that we're so concerned with broadcasting our identity to other people. And that's because we're looking for collaborative partners.
I can assure you that Caleb is also emitting a dense cloud right now.
Yes,
perhaps with social information. But what you're saying metaphorically with this notion that we're all emitting dense clouds of social information signals in how we speak, how we dress, how we move, how we, pronounce words. You write at one point in the book, I'm quoting you here, when we become preoccupied with the tiniest stain on our trouser leg and rub at it distractedly with a wet fingernail, it's our subconscious understanding of the critical importance of this information cloud. And I felt like you'd been surveilling me there, Will, because I totally catch myself doing this. I could be a little clumsy with the sandwich at lunch, drop a dollop of mayo on my pant leg, and then a few hours later, I'm in an elevator going to a parent cocktails gathering or something. And then I look down and I think that stain on my leg, it's a deal killer. These people are going to see it and think he's not people like us, and then the tribe will reject me and I might starve to death.
That's right. I mean, I have that experience too. It's always yoga on exactly the wrong place of your trouser, and I've got a white stain on my crotch. Yeah, no, it's mortifying. You don't see other animals behaving like this with such obsessive care about their appearance.
Certainly you and I are broadcasting very, very important information with our hair. Well, Caleb needs a little more volume and some gray streaks to catch up with the program. Right?
Yeah.
I'd love Caleb's color, I have to say.
Yeah, so it's enviable.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break. Coming up, we're going to take the concepts we've been describing, identification, obstacle, goal, survival, connection, status. We're going to take those and apply them to some real-world examples.
This ad redefined the story of what personal computers were. Like, we're still telling versions of that story today in the post, internet revolution.
We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Alex Kantrowitz. I'm the host of Big Technology Podcast, a longtime reporter and an on-air contributor to CNBC. And if you're like me, you're trying to figure out how artificial intelligence is changing the business world and our lives. So each week on Big Technology, I bring on key actors from companies building AI tech and outsiders trying to influence it, asking where this is all going. They come from places like NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon, and plenty more. So if you want to be smart with your wallet, your career choices, in meetings with your colleagues, and at dinner parties, tune into Big Technology Podcast on your app of choice.
So far, we've been talking about the elements of story in a pretty high-level way. So let's take these big ideas and ground them. Let's see how they work in practice in a business context. How do you sell a product? How does identification lead to persuasion? How do you convince people that what you're offering is good, which is to say, show them that it will enhance their sense of connection or elevate their status? Simple. You tell a story, or you try to. In A Story is a Deal, Will compares two Apple ads that came out in the mid-'80s. One was a smashing success. The other, dumpster fire. Let's start with that one. And when I say dumpster fire, I mean this was an ad so ineffective, it helped tank an entire product line. It's 1983, and Apple has made this ad to announce their new computer, the Lisa. It's dawn. A guy in a blue Oxford shirt is out for a bike ride. His dog runs alongside him. Oh my God, it's Kevin Costner.
The way some business people spend their time has very little to do with the clock.
He arrives at the office, only one there, sits down at his desk, powers up his Apple computer,
At Apple, we understand that business as usual isn't anymore. That's why we make the most advanced personal computers in the world. And why soon, there'll be just two kinds of people.
Hi.
Those who use computers.
Yeah, I'll be home for breakfast.
And those who use apples.
So that ad was made in 1983 by Curated Day. It was, as you said, it starred Kevin Costner. It was directed by a Hollywood guy, Adrian Lyne, who did Flashdance and Fatal Attraction. So, big budget. They thought they were telling a story, but they weren't telling a story, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because, as I said before, a story is a unit of information that describes the overcoming of an obstacle in pursuit of a goal. And there was no obstacle and no goal there. It's just a guy going to work, being a bit smug, and then saying he's going to be home for breakfast. This is boring. It doesn't stick in the mind. More importantly, it doesn't make you emotional. Obstacles and goals make you emotional. That's partly why they work as a story. And there's no emotion in this. It's just nothing. The other thing is that we don't identify with this guy at all. When the makers of the ad were boasting about its genius quality, they were saying, "Yeah, he's got a dog, so he's the kind of guy you're going to relate to." And it's like, that's not going to do it. That's not enough. So it kind of fails on every count, really. And it failed as a piece of advertising. I mean, the product was a failure, and the marketing around it was a failure too. That was an advert for the Lisa computer, the predecessor of the Mac.
If you had been at Curated Day in 1983, what would you have been saying in the strategy meetings about, whoa, wait a second, here's how we need to change this ad to make it work?
Well, firstly, you need an obstacle and a goal. Something needs to happen. The guy's got to want something. Something's got to get in his way. And then the computer has got to solve his problem somehow. And also, I think he's just a very vague character.
Yeah.
Vagueness is the enemy of storytelling. Great stories are specific. They're a specific character telling a specific story, giving a specific message, and it's just a very vague, bland, like in all kinds of storytelling, whether it's marketing or whether it's a novel or whether it's a TV show. You often see this is that you get an author who is so desperate that their character is accepted and liked. They make them likable in all ways. So they're good looking and they've got no rough edges, and they're, and actually that's a disaster, because you end up in real life, no one's like that. It's not a realistic person. And also we're looking for specifics, because we want to see, is this character people like me? Are they someone like me? Is there somebody that I identify with? And if they've got no real characteristics, then you can't, it's impossible to identify with them. And certainly just giving someone a dog, it's not enough.
Let's now listen to this other Apple ad. This came out a year after the one we just heard, and this, I think, is anything but vague. I'm just going to play a little clip from the very end just to give listeners a taste, Will, and then I'll ask you to sort of explain what the ad is.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So that was the end of 1984, which is still considered by some to be the greatest commercial ever made. So it's the same agency, had the same strategy, which was to get a Hollywood director, in this case Ridley Scott, to tell a story. But this time they told a story. And what the story is you've got these kind of ranks of grey, bald-headed drones in this kind of cult-like totalitarian state being lectured by this grim cult leader type. And through the middle of all these people comes this very beautiful, full-colour, empowered woman with a Apple logo on her tank top and a sledgehammer, and she smashes through the screen and it destroys the face of this totalitarian leader. To understand why that was so successful, you've got to understand the story world as it was in the 1980s. And back in the 1980s, this was pre-tech internet revolution. This was a time when people genuinely believed that 1994 might happen. The Cold War was still on. There was a fear that computers were not our friends, that they were going to be the tool of these totalitarian people, that the future was going to be one of control, control by the machines. And what Apple was saying was like, we hear you, we understand your concerns, but this is not Apple. Apple are standing against this. Apple are about individuality, creativity, freedom. And, all these values absolutely resonated with the audience of boomer Americans, which were watching, that ad. And they responded just enormously. So in the 100 days after that ad was shown, they bought nearly $180 million worth of Macs, which are over $500 million worth today. And the then product manager said we could have sold 200,000 Macs if we could have built them. So it just had an extraordinary result. And I think that one of the amazing things about that ad was when they were making the ad, Steve Jobs and his team still hadn't figured out what the Mac was going to be. So they had no information. So that ad is telling you nothing whatsoever about the computer. Yeah. It doesn't even show the computer because it wasn't finished yet. So despite not telling you anything at all about what the computer was, it was extraordinarily successful because it was doing all of those things. It was showing an obstacle and a goal and somebody struggling over that obstacle. But it was also, people strongly identified with its message. You're right to fear computers. Yeah. You're right to fear IBM and the domination of the machines. But that's why you need to buy an Apple, because Apple are the opposite of that. And and people talk about this ad, and I think they're right. They say that this advert didn't only redefine the story of Apple. This ad redefined the story of what personal computers were. Yeah. We're still telling versions of that story today in the post, internet revolution about technology being about liberation and creativity and freedom and self-expression. All of that was invented in that 1984 ad.
And then, of course, if you buy an Apple, now all of a sudden I've bought into the identification of that story, and now I'm emitting in my cloud of social signification. I am that person. I am the person who is creative. I am the person who stands up to the big bad IBM, right? So it's just like self-reinforcing.
Absolutely, and that's why they buy it, because again, as I said before, we're all driven to broadcast information about who we are, and we'll spend lots of money in order to successfully broadcast that information. Steve Jobs, in particular, always had an amazing instinct for this stuff, and I felt a bit cheesy talking about Apple because everyone talks about Apple, but it's like talking about story, not talking about Shakespeare. Like Apple under Steve Jobs were the masters at using storytelling to sell product and to redefine people's perception of what an Apple product was.
And what's astounding about this is that it's now 30 years later, and you cite in the book a recent survey that showed that one of the most cherished social identities for students today is whether they're an Apple person or a PC person. And when it comes to laptops, or even smartphones for that matter, they're really not that different. Right? It's a very, very similar product. So the idea that for college students today, whether they're an Apple person or a PC person is for many the most important single social signifier is just astounding. And we've seen Apple use this to great effect in, there's been a lot of controversy over if you're using an Android phone, your chats in messaging show up as green rather than blue. And this is such a status signifier, right, that it's resulted in bullying in schools. And Apple, at least in the US, has massive dominance. The iPhone has overwhelming dominance among teenagers. And probably a lot of it has to do with that social signal.
Absolutely. We don't have it quite so much outside of the US, where Android phones are much more common and we use WhatsApp. Everybody uses WhatsApp in Europe and Asia, pretty much. But in the US, of course, iMessage is dominant. The iPhone is dominant. And because iPhones are mostly more expensive than Android phones, so it goes hand in hand. If you've got an Android phone, it means that you're not as wealthy, so you're lower status. And so they deliberately, for a long time, Apple deliberately downgraded the communications from Android users in iMessage. So the video would be pixelated and you couldn't use the same kind of emojis. They held on to that idea for a long time, and they resisted changing it and making the experience the same for the Android user. But even when they were kind of forced to do that, some people say it was the EU that forced them, some people say it was China, but they were kind of forced into changing their protocols so it was equal for everybody. But even when they did that, they kept the green bubbles for Android because green bubbles were now a symbol of low status. So it's a very powerful marketing device for Apple.
I don't know if I should admit this, but my wife's former boss was so annoyed that people on her team had Androids and green bubbles that she bought them all iPhones because she just couldn't. Wow. She couldn't stomach
the
green bubbles.
That just shows you the power of this stuff. In fact, when I talked about this to my editor, she sent me a message saying, good, Android phones give me the ick. And it's like, I'm texting you from my Pixel phone. I've got a folder. It's like, guys, you got to catch up, you iPhone people. The folding phones are incredible.
Oh, okay. Look at you. Well. Meanwhile, Will, I can't resist telling you that Caleb informed me very politely in the last couple of weeks that the black T-shirts I was sometimes wearing for podcast interviews looked a little ratty. I think I may have interviewed Bill Gates in a black T-shirt. And you'll notice I'm now wearing a nice collared shirt here for you. I'm taking it up a notch. But, this was, I think that, the message I was getting so subtly was that maybe I was taking down the collective status with my choice of shirt.
Well, we had a scandal in my local gym where I go to my exercise classes where a group message was sent out by a tutor saying, keep it fresh. Make sure that when you come, you shower and you use deodorant because there's been some incidents. And they were saying everybody suddenly got really paranoid. And everybody was convinced, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? It kind of set this kind of wildfire of fear and anxiety through all the members of the gym. And one poor guy was pulled aside and said, look, dude, can you're coming straight from the building site or whatever, can you just use a bit of deodorant? And he went ballistic. Oh, gosh. He kicked off and it was a big disaster. Yeah, so it's a similar thing. You feel it's an attack on your sense of status. And I thought it was interesting about how my immediate thought was, shit, is it me? Are they talking about me? And I think that's probably 99% of people when they saw that message, shit, is it me? Are they talking about me? Like we all absolutely fear being the person that is not part of the group in any particular way.
Now, I think it's worth clarifying here what we mean by status, because of course you wrote a whole book, Status Games, which listeners after hearing this episode will want to listen to our conversation about status games. It's among our favorites. We'll have a link in the episode notes. But the way that I think psychologists would describe status and the way that you describe it is a more general sense of being valued by our community, of having some kind of importance. And I think you'd say that people of higher status in hundreds of hunter-gatherer communities that have been studied have more access to food, mates, resources, connection. That remains true for us today. And even though there's a lot of silliness in the ways that some people choose to display status, and we can disagree about what status symbols mean or which ones are worth chasing, status was clearly in our ancestral environment a positive force because it was a pressure to contribute, to add value to the community. And that's why it's so central for us. Am I saying that right? Yeah,
that's absolutely right. I mean, we've been pursuing status since before we were human, but as humans, we started pursuing it in this. We talked about how we exist in a story world. We exist in the survival world and in the story world. And in the story world, we play for status in two ways: with acts of virtue. So that's one way of being valuable to our group. So we're somebody that is selfless, generous. We help the people who are sick and the elderly, but we're also, courageous in battle. We're somebody that understands the rules, the moral rules of the group, so follows the rules and enforces the rules. So that's virtue. And then the other way that we earn status is with acts of competence. So we're good at stuff. So we can contribute to being a good hunter, a good storyteller, a good sorcerer, a good finder of sweet potatoes, whatever it might be. And so that's still true today. We play status games all through life with virtue and with acts of competence. So I call them virtue games and success games. These are the two ways. And as you say, I think people get kind of crazy about the sense about status, because when I say that we all crave status, what people hear is we all want to be rich, we all want to be pop stars, we all want to be Kim Kardashian or whatever. And that's not it. Like there are certain people, of course, who are very, very, very interested in status, and they become CEOs and celebrities and popes. But for most of us, we simply want the feeling that we are respected. So it's different from being loved. It's being respected, and we're respected for the value that we bring. Either we're a good person or we're a competent person. So most people don't want to be at the top, because with the top comes too much attention and too much responsibility. Most people are just happy going through their lives with a feeling that, I impressed people today. People value me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And local status is in some respects the healthier kind. Like part of what's made our world complex is that all too many of us are competing for a sense of feeling high status in a community of 350 million people or 8 billion people, which is impossible to achieve. Whereas a sense of feeling valued locally for our contributions, that's the kind of status seeking that we evolved to have that is arguably a healthier form.
Yeah, that's right. So we play local status games. So if we're playing for our local soccer team, we're not competing with somebody who plays for Manchester United to be in terms of how good at football we are. We're competing with our teammates, and that's true for all of life. Like, we're not all trying to compete with Michelle Obama and the King of Thailand, because if we did, we'd have a nervous breakdown. We'd never measure up. You know, the really important thing to people is that the people that we share our lives with, the people that we play our status games with, whether it's at work or, you know, in our hobby life or in this organization we're volunteering for, wherever it might be, that we are respected by those people, and we like to feel like we're above the average of those people. That's, you know, we like to feel that we are, you know, a plus member of the team.
And that's kind of empowering too, right? Because it's of course, status games can be ugly, but to remind yourself that you're playing on a different field than you may think. As a podcaster, you know, Rufus is not necessarily competing with Joe Rogan, you know?
Not successfully, anyway.
Yeah. I think that's sort of healthy and helpful to realize that, like,
Totally.
the status games we're playing are actually more narrow than we may think, and that we therefore have a greater chance of success or achieving more status.
That's right. And I think not falling into the trap that success is number one.
Yeah.
And number two is first loser. Like, that's just not how it works. I mean, it might be how it works in a 100-meter sprint. Yeah, sure. I could, fair enough. But for the rest of life, that's not how it works. You know, like you have an audience, you offer value to people. That's good. That's a success. That's literally a success.
Well, we're very happy to hear that, Will, because we are doing our best over here at the Next Big Idea Club to build community, to build value. And I think both Caleb and I were inspired, frankly, by your book on this front.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's great about this book is, like, it's not just about how to make a memorable Apple commercial. It's really about how to harness the power of story to build and run businesses, to build teams, to be a leader. And yeah, as Rufus alluded to, I mean, we've been building this company, the Next Big Idea Club, for, when did you start? Rufus started it. When, 7 years ago?
Caleb, like Elizabeth Taylor, we prefer not to talk about our age, but the podcast has just turned 5, and our Next Big Idea app is 4 years old. Our daily Substack's been around for about 6 months, so I think of us as kind of a whippersnapper.
Yeah, we're not graybeards. But I think, Will, like, one of the reason, as Rufus said, we found this book so inspiring is something we have struggled with as a team is, what is the story that we're telling with this organization? And so we thought maybe you could help us, be our story editor, help us out a little bit, figure out what is the story of this organization we're building.
Are you game, Will?
Yeah, I'm game.
Okay, good.
Let's do it.
Are you on the edge of your seat?
Well, unfortunately, going to have to stay there for just a little bit longer.
We're pressing pause here, but we'll have Will back on the show next week to tell us how the power of story can transform your business and ours.
Spoiler alert, it involves a trip to the laundromat.
We'll also get into what the science of storytelling can teach us about leadership, team building, psychology, and accomplishing audacious goals.
And Will is going to share 5 tools that every storyteller needs to master.
If you simply can't wait, part 2 is available right now on the Next Big Idea app. Otherwise, we'll see you back here next week.
Today's episode was mixed by Mike Toda. We love building a story world with the team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.